Hello, everyone. Every year, there's one book that everyone seems to have read. Back in 2008, it was a book called Netherland by Joseph O'Neill, a wonderful novel that combined all sorts of amazingly interesting things, including the bombing of the World Trade Center and cricket. I don't know quite how Joe O'Neill did it, but he brought together very unusual things. And the Guardian had the New Yorker had a headline, Beyond a Boundary, to talk about the book. And it reflected his own passion with cricket, which of course cricket is measured in terms of boundaries. Well, the good news is Joe O'Neill is back with another novel, this one called Godwin. It's not about cricket, it's about football, or what Europeans call football and Americans call soccer. It's out this week, and Joseph O'Neill is joining us from that hotbed of football enthusiasm, Brooklyn in New York. Joe, congratulations on the new book. Are you as big a fan and enthusiast of football as you are of cricket?
I probably am. Although I didn't play football as much as later. I played football obsessively till about the age of about 16 or 17, and then I stopped really. And then whereas I kept playing cricket and became kind of obsessed with cricket as a player, as well as a spectator. But now that I've stopped being an active cricketer, I'm sort of interested in football again, and I'm also, like everyone else, I'm sort of intrigued by the dimensions of the sport these days. It's such a huge sport, it's bigger than ever, and there's so much culture around the sport, so much YouTube kind of stuff, so much discussion, and of course so much money. And so I've been sort of dragged back in again into the realm of football, which I'd sort of been less interested in for a while.
Football isn't often thought of in literary terms, of course. Baseball is. DeLillo wrote a wonderful book about baseball. Is there any good literature pre-Godwin on football?
I'm sure there is.
But that means you can't think of any.
Well, I mean, when I was a youngster, there was a book by a writer called Barry Hines, who wrote the novel Kess. Orchestra for a Knave, the novel was called, and it became the movie Kess. Barry Hines was from Yorkshire, and he wrote a very good a novel which I enjoyed very much as a teenager called The Blinder, which was about a young footballer. And of course, football does pop up a lot in literature, but I'm not really an expert, I have to say. Nick Hornby wrote a book about his obsession with Arsenal. That's a kind of personal kind of memoir, really. And I think the Nick Hornby book actually marked an important moment in football culture, because football, which was a working class sort of game, became much more kind of embraced by the middle classes, as to use the phrase in the European way. I mean, in the US, of course, the middle class is a polite euphemism for the working class, but so football. So there is, and of course, a lot of writers, a lot of notable writers, have been interested in football.
The Hornby book, of course, is about how Nick Hornby, growing up in Reading, became Nick Hornby, sort of acquired a self through his passion for Arsenal Football Club. Is Godwin, in an odd way, the reverse of Hornsby's book? Is it about our Sisyphean struggle to achieve selves in the 2020s? I'm sorry to sound so pretentious. You can shoot that one down.
No, I won't say. I'm not sure I'm going to grapple directly with that question, but I will say that. I mean, first of all, Godwin. Let me just, so that people know, Godwin really has two bits to it. One bit is a football story, which is the quest to find this mysterious internet kind of talent called Godwin, who is located somewhere in Africa, but nobody knows where. And they're not even sure he's called Godwin. And the second bit of the story is told by the and the soccer story concerns two brothers. One of whom is a soccer agent who wants to find Godwin and make a fortune out of him, essentially. And one of the brothers is this kind of disenchanted technical writer who lives in Pittsburgh, and he's an American. And he agrees to help his English half brother to look for Godwin. So that's essentially the setup, and so that part of the book is very much about football, and what does it you're asking me to kind of potentially to unpack the sort of the kind of meaning of what they're up to, the wider meaning of what they're up to, and I'm not sure I can do that concisely.
You're not probably willing to. I mean, your reviewers have said that the Washington Post had a wonderful comment saying that you're going to beat us, Joseph. Not that O'Neill would ever tell a story so straightforward and polemical. Like Godwin, this novelist is a player whose charges and feints will leave you amazed and defeated. So you're a champion. You're the Pele, or we'll talk about Messi and Pele later. But and this Washington Post review also described your book as waiting for Godwin. In other words, you never really find him. The Hornby book, of course, could have been called Hornby. Nick Hornby finds himself.
Yeah.
And that was my point. I don't want to reveal everything about the book, but is Godwin himself some sort of metaphor, some opportunity, excuse for you to write about our search for meaning, particularly in the West?
Well, funny you should say that. But I do feel like the quest for meaning is like the story is like the ultimate story, isn't it? Even when you're describing even a kind of novelist or a memoirist in the case of Hornby, any story that we tell about, the dramas of men and women, is underwritten by the greater mystery that we face in our lives, which is and in our existence, which is how do we explain our situation as humans in society? How do we explain our situation our location in history? And also, and obviously, there's the larger question, which is speaking of Beckett, since you quoted him, there's this question of how do you situate our experiences within the big questions of life and death, and I suppose all of those things, mortality, hunger for kind of recognition and self knowledge, all of these things are part of underwrite the Godwin story in many ways. I mean, the other thing about the story is that it has a second narrator who isn't one of the two agents looking for Godwin, but the workmate of one of the American Wolf, who's called Lakeisha, who's a black woman. And she has her own very suppressed kind of his personal history. And we gradually learn more about that. And she has sunk her hopes for achieving her potential, achieving some sort of meaning in life in this kind of writers' co-op, technical writing co-op that she runs, and which Wolf flees from. So on the one hand, the story is divided between a person who very much believes in the collective enterprise and in the dream of cooperation, and a kind of person who, even though he's contemptuous of capitalism, finally succumbs to the idea of finding Godwin, because the whole point of finding Godwin, of course, if you're the agent, is that you make a fortune. A top footballer will be paid, I don't know, $300,000 a week.
It's and a lot of the reviews and the reading, it's going back to Conrad and finding gold, it's heart of darkness in Africa. So there's a lot of that in the book, isn't
Yeah,
there?
there is a lot of that. I mean, it's not. That's intentionally kind of. When you asked me about the metaphors and the themes, and I suppose I proceed in a slightly, as a novelist, I have to proceed kind of intuitively, so that I don't necessarily have a sort of a kind of thesis.
The world is a fog then, and you're just moving ahead through the fog as a novelist.
No, a novel is a kind of entertaining fog, and hopefully the reader will enjoy being in the fog, and we'll have a kind of, ultimately we'll have an interpretive and dynamic relationship with the novel. The reader will decide, for herself what.
Do you think that
what the meaning is.
the reader is as much in the fog as the writer? Are you suggesting that?
Oh yeah, I do. But I do think that the meaning of a novel or a passage in a novel ultimately is a collaboration between the reader and the writer. I mean, obviously, some readers will have more interesting interpretations than others. But ultimately, a novel is a pretty inert thing until it's received by the reader. And of course, we know from our readings of the classics and of the canon, the canonical writings, that our interpretation of various books changes over the centuries as the reader changes, and the books become only richer. So that a story like, for example, Robinson Crusoe is now seen as a kind of, which was once seen as a kind of fun story about a desert island, is now seen as a kind of a story of colonization. And also it's forgotten that Robinson Crusoe was wrecked, before he was wrecked on the island, was on a slaving ship, carrying slaves. And so all these sorts of details, which are not salient, like for 50 years ago, or they're merely entertaining, are nowadays, but the modern reader now will look at those details and be struck by them quite differently. So the hope in the end, I guess, with a novel, if you're trying to write a sort of, I suppose the so-called literary novel, is that you're trying to just to create this thing of language which readers will enjoy interacting with, and interpret in a variety of ways. In a ways, the whole point of writing a novel, I suspect, for me anyway, is to sort of transcend my own slightly linear and boring take on the world. I mean, I have hundreds of boring opinions about the world, and they're not particularly interesting or valuable, and they're all derived from other people's opinions, really. Whereas a novel is kind of smarter than me and more generative of knowledge in some way than I could possibly be.
It's interesting, and of course, you're probably bored with this, but after Netherland came out, Zadie Smith wrote something about there being two paths for the novel. One was the realist novel, which she put your book, Netherland, she wrote in the New York Review of Books in 2008, and then a different kind of novel. I don't want to get into that, but she described you as a realist. And actually, one of the other reviews of Godwin talks about the crisis of realist novels and perhaps the crisis of the realist novelist. I wonder whether the founders of realism, the Zolas or the Dickens in the 19th century, they didn't describe writing about the world and their literature as writing in a fog. Has the world changed, Joseph, for realist novelists like yourself? Is the world more of a fog?
I can't speak for other writers, but I definitely, I do find the world very foggy.
And yet you're still, are you comfortable with this term? I'm not sure if it was your term or Zadie Smith's term. Are you comfortable describing yourself as a realist novelist?
Well, not particularly. I mean, I don't, realism, what does it even mean? I mean, who isn't a realist novelist? There are every kinds of, even the kind of surrealists are realists, because otherwise the word realism wouldn't appear in their sort of title. I mean, I'm not quite sure, to be honest, I'm not quite sure what she means by realism. I mean, in that essay, she sort of puts together in one group Zola and Flaubert and Saul Bellow and people like this, and they're all very, very different writers. I don't sort of, I don't sort of analyze my writing in those kind of categories. I guess I approach it much more artistically. I mean, if I'm evaluating a piece of literature for my own purposes, I don't ask myself, well, is this realist or is it not realist? I sort of read a book and I first of all, I take note of whether I enjoy it or not, because I think that's very important. Because I don't really think I sort of, and then the second thing I ask myself is, what are the risks that are being taken in this book? What risks is the writer taking? What artistic kind of, how much kind of artistic investment is there in this book? And then of course, then you have a very different, then you become less kind of dogmatic about what is artistically valuable and what isn't. I mean, take someone like Colm Tóibín, who's a sort of, would be much more kind of, would he? I mean, I don't know. Would you
He's even written a book called Brooklyn, right? He has a new book.
Well, he wrote a book called Brooklyn, but he would be a realist. He tells stories of kind of stories that appear to be quite straightforward in some ways, like linguistically, but on the level of emotion, he's taking enormous risks. I mean, he's taking risks. He's writing about something that's very, very difficult to write about, certainly in the book that he's just published, which is the sort of fateful love encounter. That's that's really quite hard to write about without coming off as, as cheesy or as, or something like that. And he succeeds in that without sort of necessarily. And whereas another book might be much more artistically kind of risk taking on the level of the sentence or on the level of subject matter. I'm much more kind of receptive to a whole range of kinds of writing, whether it's Nabokov on the one hand, who's quite sort of, I suppose, a realist, if you want to, potentially, I don't know. You see, that's the problem. What is a non-realist? Is it somebody who populates their novels with unfeasible or supernatural kind of stuff? I just don't know what that is. It's a sort of, it's a handy word in some situations, but if you apply any pressure to it, it starts to fall apart a little bit.
We're speaking with Joseph O'Neill, a very well-known novelist, not a realist perhaps, or perhaps a realist, but certainly the author of Godwin, wonderful new book that's just out this week. Want to thank our friends at Liberties, a quarterly of culture and politics, for helping us bring wonderful guests like Joseph O'Neill. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back to talk more Godwin, more football, and more about the challenges and fogginess of the 2020s. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Joseph O'Neill. Everyone knows about him. Very world-famous writer, author of Netherlands, and now this new book, Godwin. I was going to call it Godlands, but it's Godwin. Joe, this took you 10 years. You were doing other things, of course.
I was. Let's not exaggerate. Anyway. Yeah.
Well, the last novel came out when?
10 years ago.
So why the wait? Have you been busy with other writing, doing other stuff?
Well,
or does some books just take longer than others?
I don't really have, it turns out I don't really have much more in me than a novel every 10 years. I have a book of short stories that came out in the meantime. That was kind of, that took a certain amount of writing. And, but the sort of thing, but I've also been, I'm just not very prolific. It does take me a very long time to write. And I've also, like so many people in all walks of life, since about 20, I've been slightly distracted by the political sort of situation in the United States after 2016, and kind of involved in a lot of activity and stuff on that front. So on a pro bono basis, unfortunately. Yeah, so I've been very busy and I feel very exhausted. But I've only
Yeah,
got one
you
novel
wrote an
to
interesting
for it.
thing recently in the New York Review, Save the Party, Save the World. You're not a big fan of Donald Trump, like most of us. Is there a connection between the rise of men like Trump in the 2020s and the Godwin novel, or are they about different things?
Well, I mean, there's bound to be some connection, and the book ends on by proposing some connection or suggesting some sort of connection. I do feel that the interesting thing about one of the narrators, Wolf, is that he's a sort of supposedly a kind of left-wing idealist. And yet when his idealism is put under pressure by the possibility of finding Godwin and making a fortune by it, he finds that he's irresistibly drawn to it. And the question, I suppose, is what is the substance of this attraction to Godwin? I mean, if you said to me, for example, let's go find Godwin in Africa, I couldn't be bothered. And you said to me, well, there's be lots of money in it. I would say, well, so what? It's not how I want to spend my. But there is the kind of thing which I've become aware of, and which has become more and more visible, which is a pathological kind of greed and obsession with money, and that seems to be a feature of the Donald Trump phenomenon, and it's also a phenomenon which on the subject of sport has, for example, torn apart the professional golf world. Not that that's going to.
Yeah, and I just did a show on my weekly tech show. The NBA, the National Basketball Association in the US, has just sold the rights of their league for, I think, $76 billion for the next 10 years. So it's not just football and golf, it's basketball, it's probably even cricket.
Yeah. I mean, what's happened, I mean, in the Gulf, as we know, what happened is that this a Saudi Arabian enterprise, essentially state-backed enterprise, which was very supported by Donald Trump, proposed to golfers that they essentially stop playing competitive golf as we know it and join a kind of, a strange kind of league in Saudi Arabia, a made-up new golf league, and for essentially abandoning their legacy careers, they would be paid a huge amount of money, and a number of them took it up, and that's fine. That didn't surprise me. But what really did surprise me was the sort of narrative around that whole thing, which is that people saying, "Well, I mean, he's been offered $250 million. Can you blame him?" And I was like, well, yes, I didn't understand that. I mean, if I've already got $50 million, I'm exactly the sort of person who shouldn't be interested in getting $250 million. I just didn't. So there is a sort of a thing in our culture, and Godwin does deal with this, and it may be capitalism, I don't know, or it may be something else, maybe just the United States. There's a thing in which it's sort of like seen as kind of almost it's like your moral imperative to not refuse huge amounts of money.
Is that one of the reasons why you chose to write this book around football? You mentioned the Saudis, who have tried to ruin the golf game. They're also in the business of ruining football. They're trying to host the 2034 World Cup, and now they've been accused of using forced labor, which is hardly a surprise. They or other Gulf states have taken over ownership of many of the leading clubs in the world. Manchester City and PSG come to mind. Has this money, and it's not just Gulf money, it's Russian money, it's Chinese money, it's Western European and American money, has it ruined the game of football?
Not yet. But I mean, I think it's beginning to. There are some worrying signs. I mean, first of all, they had the World Cup held in Qatar, or Qatar, in the middle of the traditional football season. That was in a country which has no kind of history of playing the game, no culture of playing the game, and in a country which sort of killed, who knows how many people, hundreds, if not thousands, of construction workers were sort of either enslaved or died building these stadiums. And of course, the World Cup was offered, obviously corrupt. I mean, no one's going to vote for a World Cup to be held in the off season, in the middle of the season in Qatar, unless they're being paid to do that. So there's an enormous amount of corruption. I mean, it's always been. When I was writing this book, I was speaking with a friend of mine who knows the football business quite well, and he was talking about the possibility that a journalist might stumble on a story and essentially sell the story to the people in the story for their silence. And I'd say, really, a journalist would do that? And he said to me, Joe, everyone's bent in football. Everyone.
Yeah, and you've got that. I was just perusing the novel before we did this conversation.
It's in it, yeah.
It's that there's a quote like that, and it's chilling, Joseph, in the sense that people believe in football. It's an odd thing. In our foggy world, they believe more and more in these players, in the Lionel Messis of the world, who just done a huge deal with a new sports drink, multi-billionaires, no doubt, who seem to be insatiable in their lust for money. So when you talk about Godwin being the next Messi, there's a warning there, isn't there? Because we've already got one Messi, and that's one Messi too many.
Well, I don't know. A lot of football fans would disagree. The thing about Messi, I mean, here's the problem I don't think footballers getting paid fortunes is really the main problem.
The agents?
I think the main problem is that there's just too much money around. The problem is, let's say, because of the English Premier League is now viewed around the world, and the TV rights are just worth billions, essentially. And so the question arises, who should keep the money? Should it be the owners of the football clubs, or should it be the players, or should it be the TV companies and the media companies and so on and so forth? And of course, if you think about it for a second, you say to yourself, well, obviously the footballers are the ones creating this value, and it's better that they should have it than they're the laborers, rather than the owners of the means of production, just not to be too Marxist about it. And so, obviously, so there's just so much money, and it's corrupting. A lot of people, I support Manchester United, and, Manchester United, a very powerful club, a very rich club, buys lots of players, pays them a lot of money. It's been doing horribly for 10 years. And I feel like one of the reasons, and the players, they keep buying these good players, and the good players suddenly stop playing badly after a while. And I sort of feel like part of the problem is that if you triple or quadruple the wages of your players so that they're all getting £300,000 a week or £250,000 a week, you sort of, it's very difficult if you're getting paid that much money, unless you're a true obsessive like Messi would be, or Ronaldo. These people are very obsessive, extreme characters. But for a lot of people, if you and I were being paid £250,000 a week, it might sort of demotivate us a little bit after a few weeks, So I do feel like there's something intrinsically corrupting about having lots of money.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the comments in The Guardian described the book as a novel of two halves, using the cliche of football. On the one hand, it's about football and Africa. On the other hand, it's about a cooperative in the US, a writers' cooperative. But are there solutions within football that bring the two halves of the book together? The German model, for example, where the fans own the teams in comparison with the billionaires and multi-billionaires who own the teams in the US and the UK. Is it ultimately an economic, political issue?
It is. It's also a cultural issue. I mean, the economics of the Bundesliga are fairly similar to the economics of the Premier League, or could be. But according to German culture, it's permissible for where the football teams are seen as clubs. They're rooted in their communities. The fans are members of the club, and that membership provides for the financing of many of these clubs. So that's a different model. Whereas in England, these football clubs are now sort of limited corporations owned by either billionaires or in the case of Manchester United, a publicly listed company where the majority of the stock is owned by the Glazer family, which is a family
who made a fortune. Is there any irony that you mentioned Manchester United, that one of the more expensive players they bought was from Borussia Dortmund in Germany? He came to Manchester United. They paid a huge amount of money for him. He didn't perform, so they gave up on him, and he went back to Borussia Dortmund and has done extremely well. Do you think that in an odd way, a more just kind of ownership produces not just happier players, but better players?
I mean, I do. I mean, I don't know about that. You're talking about the case of Jadon Sancho. That's a complicated case. I feel Jadon Sancho is a bit of a lost soul as a young man who has all sorts of issues, I believe. But I do feel like it's obvious to me that if you want to make your children miserable, you should make a fortune for yourself and then give it to your children. That's just a recipe for like misery. So why? It's a drug. Money is essentially this kind of, it's like this heroin, and it's the sign of a spiritually vacuous kind of society. That's also, it strikes me as, see, all this stuff used to be self-evident. I mean, when you and I think we're sort of roughly the same age, were growing up, it wasn't a given that the number one goal in life was to accumulate as much money as possible.
But you live in Brooklyn, Joseph. I'm guessing that most of your neighbors don't believe that, or are you suggesting they do and they just don't acknowledge it?
Well, I live in a very odd sort of neighborhood, but I do feel like there's a sort of I don't know. I do feel it's very difficult. It's the idealism, the sort of idealism of socialism, for example, or the cooperative movement. I feel like the culture today is kind of weirdly inhospitable to it, except in the most kind of, performative sort of way. I mean, American leftism is so consumeristic. It's sort of funny, if it wasn't so sad. I mean, the American.
What do you mean, American leftism is consumeristic?
Well, I mean, they're sort of like, if you ask them about what's the economy like, they'll just sort of moan about how expensive restaurants are. I mean, and I'm just like,
but they are expensive in Brooklyn.
Well, I know, but that's not. Karl Marx isn't like, I'm going to make restaurants more affordable for everybody. It's about, it's like there are sort of very important indices that sort of show that, the wealth has grown in the last 3.5 years, above all for the kind of the least wealthy, and somehow that doesn't sort of cut much ice with a lot of kind of self-styled leftists, and also we've had enormous advances in kind of trade unionism. So there's all sorts of, stuff that I would have thought would be of importance to kind of leftists, and apparently not that important.
Joseph, coming back to realism, I know it's not a term you particularly like, but there is a strong tradition, 19th century, thinking of Zola's novels against industrial capitalism or Dickens. There's a strong tradition of hostility to the kind of overt inequality and massive wealth. Is what you're saying any different from what Dickens or Zola felt about 19th century industrial capitalism?
I doubt it. I mean, obviously, what we're dealing with now, the facts are slightly different. But the slightly worrying thing, as far as Andrew, I find what you said rather worrying, because, when Dickens is talking about sort of the horrors of as you say, kind of factory work, the horrors of the dehumanization of the working class, the sort of thing which which sort of transfixed Marx and other thinkers. The idea was that 150 years later, that we'd have made some significant progress on that front, and that it wouldn't really be up to me. I wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. But now we're seeing child labor is coming back into fashion. Dictatorship is now apparently cool again, and most people are okay with it, or not most people, but a lot of people seem to be okay with it. And so, yeah, it is rather alarmingly all that sort of stuff that we thought was kind of interestingly kind of historical, the preoccupations of Zola, or to bring it to the United States, Upton Sinclair with the jungle and all that kind of stuff. We all thought, or John Steinbeck, apparently these are now right up to horribly contemporaneous in their preoccupations.
Has anything really changed? I mean, Conrad's, of course, Heart of Darkness was the great masterpiece about Western colonization of Africa. Is Godwin suggesting in a foggy way, Joe, that not much has changed, that we still live in a deeply colonial world? It's just, rather than the East India Company, it's Manchester United?
Well, I do feel like, I think Manchester United is much more benign than the East India Company.
Which isn't saying much.
Well, not much, but I think I'm going to emphasize much. I don't think Manchester United has kind of, sort of robbed vast subcontinents of their autonomy. But I do feel like the new thing, on the face of it, is what one could call, globalization.
Mm. Which is your thing. It's beyond the boundary, which you wrote about in Netherlands. Your background is very, very globalized, for better or worse.
Yeah, it is. I'm half Turkish, half Irish. I grew up in Holland, speaking French with my mother, and went to kind of an international school. And then I lived in England for about 15 years.
You're the problem, Joe. If we can get rid of you, then we can go back to justice.
It's true. I am. It's the global scum that's the problem.
The global scum from Brooklyn.
I mean, I think the issue is, I do think that what globalization has done is, and this sort of underwrites all of my writing, my novels, not really my short stories. What globalization has done is create a crisis of ethics. Globalization arises not just in the context of enormous trade. It arises also in the context of enormous international transparency, so that we're more than ever now aware of the suffering of people around the world than we ever were. And those people have a much greater capacity for movement, because they're much more aware of the possibility of improving their lives than would have been the case even 50 years ago or 40 years ago. So that if you look at so that all of our Western tradition of ethics is based on essentially hospitality and the Good Samaritan, the idea of the Good Samaritan, which is to say, that we're supposed to love our neighbor even if he's not like us, even if he's the other, and that's a doable proposition. When when you only bump into a Samaritan once every 25 years as you're walking down the road, but when there are billions of people falling by the wayside, your whole system of law, your system of international law, your system of ethics comes under enormous pressure, and you have to come up with some sort of response to that. And I think that's been a real problem. And I think, like, look at the situation. Even warfare is different now. It used to be the case that in the old imperial days, and in fact as recently as I think the 1990s, when the Gulf War was happening, and both the first and the second Gulf War, the United States could, with impunity and opacity, kill thousands and thousands of people. And now, as we're seeing in Gaza, with the rise of the internet, war can't be conducted like that anymore. The United States can't just write a check for Israel to sort of murder lots of people, to tens of thousands of civilians in breach of international law, without there being a trauma in the United States, which in turn causes a huge political upheaval. It's just not that easy to sort of, it's not the same, put it that way, as it was before. So there are lots of details about our political existence. And I think all of us feel, much more stress. I mean, look, I asked my parents, who've obviously been around a bit longer than I have, and who are in their mid-80s. I said, what does it feel like to you, this era, where everyone's so worked up the whole time about Brexit and Trump and the invasion of Ukraine and what's going on? Has it always been like this? Have people always been anxious about politics like this? And they said no. They've never been more kind of anxious about it, or more kind of, confronted with it. It's a different world for them, and things have changed, and psychologically it's quite different now. We're difficult animals in the realm of politics. I mean, we have this conversation we're having now wouldn't probably have been held 20 or 15 years ago. We wouldn't have had this.
We wouldn't have had the internet. I mean, someone just wrote a book about our age of anxiety, blaming everything on social media. Does technology add to the opacity, you used that word earlier, Joe, of the world? Does that make your work as a novelist, as someone who invests massive amounts of time in writing a book, does that make it harder in a world where people just shoot off tweets every 10 seconds?
I mean, yeah, yes, I think it does. Honestly, it does. I do feel like, first of all, the novel is mostly a bourgeois pastime. To enjoy a novel, you have to pick it up and sit down for a few hours and devote yourself to it. And
especially yours.
Yeah, if you say so.
I'm teasing you, but yours they're not forbidding, but they're not the easiest of things.
Well, I mean, I'm going to say Godwin is like my version of a kind of page turner, by the way. That's my most page turning book I've written. But so yeah. But now, if you said to someone, look, I can't wait to get home now and sort of read a book for 3 hours, sitting down and just looking at turning the pages, people are going to think, wow, that's an unusual thing to do. Whereas, of course, only 10 years ago, that was a very normal thing to do, or 15 years ago. It's only now with the advent of the phone and the TV and all the rest of it, and these podcasts, if I may say so, that
we can blame it. So, are you ultimately a bit of an old-fashioned bourgeois moralist? You don't like money, you want everyone to read books?
I'm not going to disagree with you, although I mean, I do feel that that's what my books are about, as it were. I do sort of think about my books artistically. I don't think of them in terms of my kind of personal kind of inclinations and likes and dislikes, but am I in favor of book culture? Yes, I am. Is that a bourgeois thing to be in favor of? Absolutely.
Do you think that one fix here is to tell to be a bit more honest with ourselves? One of the characters in your book isn't very honest about himself, about his own goals. Do we need to be more self-critical here, Joe? Is that what you're suggesting in part in Godwin?
I don't know. I mean, how would that work, Andrew? Just out of interest.
Well, let me use a football metaphor. You've revealed who you support. The only team that's been worse than Manchester United over the last few years is Spurs. And Harry Kane was our symbol, our icon, our talisman. And I used to go sometimes to a pub around the corner from you in Brooklyn, actually in New York, to watch Spurs. And Kane would always score. And after he scored, everyone would sing. And this is in an American pub. Harry Kane, he's one of our own. And I wonder whether, I mean, we can't blame the state of the world on Spurs or Manchester United or Harry Kane, but I wonder whether in the amphitheater of lies of football, it enables us to tell lies about ourselves. Because of course, for people in New York, Harry Kane isn't one of their own, and football peddles on loyalty. Every time a player scores a goal, he kisses his badge, and the more he kisses his badge, the more he knows he's lying. So is football an example of a spectacle where everyone is lying, everyone's telling pork pies?
No, I don't. I sort of refuse that kind of idea. I obviously, obviously we're not in utopia. Football is not an entertainment that belongs to utopia. It's an entertainment that is that has all sorts of flaws to it. I do feel like one of the sort of moral and intellectual vices of our era is this kind of gratuitous complication of everything, and relativism, I suppose. So that if and it's sort of crippling in the political sphere and the moral sphere. It stops people from kind of being as kind of clear-sighted as they could be about who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, because the whole idea of the white hat and the black hat are now kind of in question in a way that is kind of in question in a way that is sort of like an entertainment. Somebody stabs somebody in the chest, you're like, yeah, we could sort of condemn the person who did the stabbing, but it's kind of more entertaining actually to sort of wonder about it a little bit.
Well, that's the cult of true crime these days.
Well, it's the cult of Donald Trump, which is a true crime cult. On the one hand, he's obviously a loathsome idiot. On the other hand, and that in the old days would be like obvious to people, but on the other hand, it's kind of let's just kind of go along with it for a bit and sort of talk about him and analyze it and this, that, and the other, and let's build this and let's develop a kind of entertaining culture around Donald Trump. I mean, we may not vote for him, but we'll sort of use Donald Trump to sort of amuse ourselves in certain sorts of ways by sort of being analytic about him and all the rest of it. And I just find that so mediocre. There's so much kind of analytic mediocrity out there on people like Trump. And a lot of it comes from, people who are sort of like, and a lot of it comes from online and things like that, people being contrarian and people sort of having their takes and all the rest of it. So there is a moment in Godwin, there is a moment in Godwin where the narrator Wolf, who himself is kind of obviously flawed, as flawed as the rest of us, says, he wonders if with global warming, a sort of secret continent of idiocy hasn't been melted, and there's so much of it going around. Of course, in my mind, when I'm writing Wolf, I have in my mind this is a guy who might sort of fall for Trump in some stupid way because he so sort of overcomplicates things.
This is Wolf. This isn't Godwin.
Yeah, it's Wolf. Godwin is the African soccer prospect.
Yeah, no, I know. So finally, Joe, I got to ask you about it's a brilliant name because in football terms, it reminds me of the managerial cliche. That was a good win. How do you come up with the name? I mean, obviously there's the God bit and the win bit. Is it all connected, or was this just, am I reading too much into a name?
Well, it's sort of intuitive, isn't it? You sort of find a name and then you like it, and then afterwards
it's a great name.
Well, I got it from my friend Peter Godwin. Do you know Peter Godwin?
Wait, is that Godwin's Law, the law about Hitler?
No, not the Godwin's Law guy. Peter Godwin is a Zimbabwean writer and the author of a classic memoir of Zimbabwe called Mukiwa, and is a dear friend of mine. And I just wanted a resonant sort of name, which would resonate, and I say resonant for all the reasons that you mentioned. And Godwin was the name. I got it from his name, his surname Godwin, which it turns out he learned on his deathbed was an invented name because his father had kept it as a secret from the whole family that he was in fact Jewish and had escaped from Eastern Europe to England and had assumed the name of Godwin. And in fact, Peter writes about it in one of his books. So that's where I got it from. Peter Godwin, a great writer.
So finally, Joe, talking to the New York Times, concluded on the reviews of your book saying, this is a very smart book. I'm not sure that's a compliment. Do you think you can be too smart? Do you think you're too smart as a writer?
No, I'm certainly not too smart. There's no danger of that. I may not be very good, but I'm not too smart. No, I mean, I'm happy to be called too smart. I'll take it. I mean, if someone said to you, Andrew, the problem with Andrew is that he's too smart, you'd be like, I've had worse reviews, I
think people would say, I think I'm too smart.
I don't know. But, I'll take it. I don't know. I don't know. What can I say? He doesn't want to compliment me. The reviewer doesn't want to compliment me. He doesn't have to.